Now, I met my wife 4 years later, 5 years after my wife passed away. She's a Holocaust survivor. This is Ruth Eisenberg. Could you stand up? She had 2 children, 1 boy and a girl, and 4 grandchildren. Believe me, we are 21 years married now. I love our children like I love my own children, my own grandchildren. They have a wonderful life, and we see a lot of knackers on them. And that's what I could say, thank God. And thank you very much for listening to me.
So we have time for questions and answers, and I'll bring the microphone around to people who have questions.
One of the questions I ask anytime I meet someone such as yourself, it's the same thing I asked my father, who grew up in Germany, and his brother, my uncle, is when were you first aware that something was not right over there?
You mean in camp?
Well, no, I mean, you talk about being 17 years old when
yeah, when the Germans got in 1939, yeah. So they knew the make first they made a ghetto. The Jewish people had to live just on these streets, you know. And the other streets they gave over to the Polish people. So like a ghetto. So we were there.
So there was no indication like my father...
To go out from there?
Well, like my father remembers, he was 12 years old in 1938 when he came here, and he remembers seeing signs like Juden Unterwunsch, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, that Jews not welcome. That's the first thing he remembered seeing, and my uncle remembers something else, and that type of thing.
In 1938, everybody was peaceful in Poland. But this happened in 1939. In October, they came in to our town. And the minute they got into our town, they were making ghettos, and they were taking Jewish people, like men and women, to work. What was the work that they had in our town? To shovel the snow, because they came in October, and over there the winter starts very early. And then they had to do the sidewalks to clean, and other work. And in 1941, like I told you, that the vehicle came, it took us away, 50 people, into this camp. And since then, I didn't know anything about this town no more. I just found out in 42, but people knew that our town was taken out, so we had no home, nobody lived there anymore.
Thank you for sharing.
Good. When the Russians came in, we were already free to go from one town to the other. There was no more ghettos, there was no partitions that you can't go here, that you can't go there. So I got free in 44, because when they took our town where I was hiding, it was in 1944 they came in first. And then they stopped for 6 months to close to Warsaw, because the Polish army told the Russian government that they want to take Poland themselves. You know? So they stopped for 6 months. If not, a lot of Jewish Holocaust survivors wouldn't be alive today if the Russians wouldn't stop that time for 6 months and waiting for the Polish army to make them free.
Mr. Browning, have you had a chance to interview perpetrators, and what was your sort of feedback or your impression of that?
No, I have not interviewed perpetrators. They don't volunteer themselves for that. The sources I've used there are twofold, both what they wrote during the war in their functions as employees of the German government, and secondly, the interrogations, post-war trials. So while they don't have to talk to me if they get subpoenaed by the prosecuting attorney for a trial, then they do have to come in and talk. And so what I know about German perpetrators, I've known from reading their extensive interrogations in the post-war period and the documents they themselves constructed during the war.
Any ordinary German citizens or people who were witnesses were not the victims?
I'm afraid I don't understand. Most of these people were ordinary, what I call ordinary Germans. But I don't think I'm answering your question.
Right. I'm trying to see from the other side, from the German side, people who lived during that area were not the victims, but were either, I don't know, bystanders or.
Oh yeah. Well, in this area was, of course, a town in Poland. So the bystanders. I mean, they're in this town. There's actually four groups of people. You have the Polish inhabitants, the German occupiers, Ukrainians that are hired as a security force of the factory and are the guards at the camp, and the Jewish prisoners. So you have four different ethnic groups involved. And in terms of the majority, of course, it's majority Polish. And as I said, some Poles would take and keep Jewish property and would bring it to the factory, would trade for survival within the camp. People, who did well, usually did well because they had Polish friends who helped them. On the other hand, one of the great reasons why people didn't try to escape the camps, which were not heavily guarded, is that there were also Poles who were quite willing to sell information to the Germans to denounce and turn them in. So you were very vulnerable. If you left camp, you never knew who you were going to run into. And there were many Poles who were quite willing to get benefits from the Germans by betraying Jews. So outside the camp was terribly insecure because you simply didn't know what kind of Pole that you were going to run into, and if you had the wrong one, then you were done. So that it was safer to be within the camp than to be exposed outside the camp, precisely because there were at least some Poles who were quite willing to turn Jews into the Germans.
So 2 weeks ago, BMW, after a long historical research, admitted the fact that they used slave labor in their factories to very little fanfare. Any feeling on that sort of disclosure, or?
I didn't hear the first part of the sentence. Who was it disclosed?
BMW.
Oh, BMW. Oh,
Yeah, the BMW family, kind of the next generation. After becoming aware of this, I think 20 years ago, we had a whole bunch of research. And then finally, I think like a week before Rosh Hashanah admitted that they had used, slave labor. There's very little, even after the Audi sort of settlement of the slave labor. Do you see that as changing down the road, or?
Well, I think it's gone kind of in stages. There was, of course, at Nuremberg, initially they were going to prosecute some of the German corporations, and there was a trial of Krupp, and he made guns, so it was easy to go after him. And then they were going to have trials of some of the others, and that fell apart as the Cold War is building up, and we wanted German economic recovery, and we wanted them having a prosperous economy to be our ally rather than to be punishing them. So German corporate rule basically got off very easily. And while German courts in the post-war period would prosecute SS, they didn't want to go after other kinds of perpetrators. So if you were in the military or you were in industry, basically you had nothing to worry about. And it really is the restitution trials in the late 90s that finally forced a number of German corporations to come clean. And so some of them, as a kind of anticipation, would in fact commission works to look at their own company history and to have a kind of mea culpa, oh yes, we were guilty and we're coming clean, and then they would make a donation to something, and they'd say, okay, everything's all right. And some stonewall. And if BMW says now we use slave labor, well, they're the last people to know that because everybody else has had that for a long time. There's no major corporation in Germany that did it. And of course, the myth earlier was, well, they forced us to. Of course, the documentation, they were begging for. There was a huge shortage of labor, and that corporations were vying with one another for allotments of slave labor. Many were not Jewish. Many of the slave laborers that come back to Germany are from the Ukraine and Russia and Poland and elsewhere. The slave labor in Poland, because the Poles were being taken to Germany, then they're filling the German factories there with Jewish labor. So there's almost no major German corporation that at some point isn't using slave labor. They couldn't have functioned. And that was just... At the end of the war, there are 7 million foreign laborers in Germany. Almost all of them brought to Germany against their will. And that doesn't count people like Jews in Poland who weren't brought back to Germany but are working abroad. So the total number of forced laborers is in the many millions. And that any corporation said, oh, we didn't do that, it just does not break their space.
While I bring the microphone over there, I have a question for both of you. As a person, a Jewish person of a couple of generations after you, we learned about the Holocaust primarily through the story of the death camps as pretty much a story of terror every day. And I'm wondering if, particularly given the Srebrenica situation, is there a sense that there was a day that was sort of a normal day? Was there such a thing as normal daily life while you were working, or for the people who worked in the factory at the camp?
What was your normal day like? Describe one day in the camp. From morning to night, what was one day like? What was the normal activity?
The normal activity was that the morning we got up in the camp, who was alive, because every day were less people there. This one got shot this way, the other one got shot the other way. By law, people survived, in the camp. So we were going in the morning, we got some coffee. They used to have a place where they were making coffee, in the camp. They were making coffee and they gave you a slice of bread. This you had to keep a whole day for yourself. Now the work was like this. I was working in an ammunition place, in the factory. Mr. Brown is also about it, but I go home. This was an 8-hour work. This was a factory where we were going out on the field with like the railroad track, the tracks, with a wagon. You picked up some old iron and different things, and that's what they called it, a hochhorn. This hochhorn was binding everything together and came out pieces of iron. The ganze lumps, the long ones. People were working by the factory there by the ovens, and I was working outside. Summer and winter, you had to go out and pick up to deliver this stuff for this oven. And after the 8 hours, we went back to the bar. But all the time we didn't go by ourselves, so there either Verkshus or the Ukrainians were watching us. Jewish police were just inside the camp.
I'll just add that the job, one of the jobs, and Mr. Eisenberg had this, was pushing these huge heavy carts on rails of iron ore or scrap metal up to the blast furnace where it would be melted down, and then that's used, taken to the rolling mill, and then taken to the factory, turned into shells and grenade casings, which is what
This was everything was for our own service.
And this is physically one of the hardest, least desirable jobs.
Yeah,
Yeah, people with extra money paid to get less arduous jobs. If you came from the outside, like he did, then this is the kind of job that you were left with.
No, we
Pushing
didn't,
these
we
huge
didn't
cars.
get paid.
No, you didn't. The people who didn't want to do that paid the Germans.
I wanted to ask for Professor Browning, at his Nuremberg trial, didn't Albert Speer claim that he had saved many, many people through the slave labor program? If you remember, he was probably the most famous defendant because he was the most senior one who was not executed.
Yeah, he certainly had a very clever defense. I mean, as I recall, his pose was, he was just an architect and a technocrat, and he was then put in charge of the war economy, and that he was trying, of course, to increase war production, and you had to get labor, but if you saved, one excuse is people went to factories, survived in greater numbers, and they did. Of the 70% of the Erpschnick which was sent to Treblinka, there was no survivors. Of the 30% that went to the camps, I have 292 testimonies, and probably 500 to 600 people may have survived out of the 2,400 that went through these camps, so maybe a 20–25% survival rate. They weren't sent to the camps to save their lives. They were sent to the camps to make guns for the Germans to kill other people first, and their turn would come later. But he also claimed, well, of course, he didn't know what was happening to the Jews. He should have known. His guilt was not finding out what he ought to have known, and thus was a crime of omission, a crime of ignorance. That was hogwash. Auschwitz, which is, of course, one of the main camps, had factories, satellite camps, 39 of them. Corporate 500 built factories all around Auschwitz. He's the head of the German war economy. He doesn't know where his factories are. This is just mind-boggling. Before that, of course, he was head of rebuilding Berlin, so he's in charge of vacating all the Jewish apartments and deciding who will get what and what will be rebuilt. So he's divvying up Jewish property right and left that had been emptied by the deportations. So Speer was very clever. He was much smarter than many of the Nazi criminals. And I guess psychologically the Allies wanted their less bad Nazi that they could acquit, or at least show that there wasn't a kangaroo court. And Speer played on it. And
Why did the commission buy his testimony?
Well, one, we didn't know as much then. We were just, people who were preparing this trial were just at the very beginning of getting into the German documentation. So they knew very little yet. I mean, if you capture the archives of a country and you have a few 20-some-year-old lawyers who are supposed to sort through millions of pages of paper, you're looking for the smoking pistol documents of people like Goering and Ribbentrop. And Speer didn't seem quite as bad. He's a charming person to interrogate him. So you're not going after him as one of not being the worst of the worst. So I think he got the benefit of the doubt, in part because he was just played the right cards. He was the repentant Nazi. Oh, I should have known. It was terrible of me that I didn't know better. While others were making much more preposterous kinds of statements. So the kind of fake repentance and his plea of guilt by ignorance, not guilt by willfulness, just played very well.
It sounds like you read the book by Gitta Sereni about the struggle with the truth.
Yes, I mean, I know Gitta Sereni, in fact, fairly well. And she wrote a book I really liked, which she did, was the one on Franz Steinway, Into That Darkness. It's a fabulous book. I'm a little less persuaded by her Speer book. I think she got a little too close to her subject that she was investigating. And like the interrogators at Nuremberg, fell a little bit under his spell. He must have been an extraordinarily charismatic figure, because I think even Gitta Sereni, who was a very tough journalist, I think couldn't quite keep her distance. So he was, yes, I think, an extraordinary personality, and I think that saved him.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Eisenberg. I'm curious. I was born in Chizhova in Poland. Was that close to the area, to the town that you lived in?
Our town, not far. I know about it.
And when we left in 1930, we had set 4 generations of family that were all murdered in August of 1941. The whole town was driven out to the forest, to Schullsborg. Was that the place that you mentioned when you mentioned them being driven out of town and killed?
Yes, it's true that they did wipe up a lot of time before they got into to be translated to 1942.
And this was August of 1941, the whole town, all the Jews.
No, they didn't chase out the Jewish people. I come from Poland. In 41, they didn't touch the Jews. They make you work for them. Or they came in like they took an hour town, they took 50 boys to go to this factory to work. And they went into another town that took like say 500 people. Yeah. But otherwise they didn't close out. They put them in ghetto, like even the 2 streets or the 4 streets, that they can't go through the whole town.
Well, we have a copy of the, what they call the Yisker book, which is oral history of the various shtetls in Poland. And in that oral history, they, some of the survivors report what happened in August of 1941 when the Jews were rounded up and murdered that night.
This is because there are 2 parts of Poland where you have a different schedule. In the parts of Poland that Germany conquers up to the Molotov-Ribbentrop line, the partition line, and that they get in 39, they build ghettos, and then that is liquidate those ghettos in 1942. The part of Poland the Soviet Union occupies in 39, and which Germany enters in 41, where Ruth Eisenberg is from. Then the Einsatzgruppen come through, and the mass killings begin in the summer of 1941. And so the killing is, initial wave of killing is by firing squad, not by deportation to the death camp, but coming through and shooting in the villages. So your town is, I would suspect that your town is in that area of what's called Ostgalicia, Eastern Galicia, and this is where the German mobile firing squads begin the mass murder in the summer of 1941.
Thank you.
I want to ask you about the factories. My understanding is, listening to you, that you build munitions. Can you tell us a little bit more from Mr. Ron what kind of munitions were built for the factory, or just bullets, or how were people trained, because they weren't not the natural thing to build that thing? And was there any instances of explosions where the whole factory was blown up by death?
Yeah, in this particular town, after World War I, the Poles decided to build a munitions factory there, in part because one of the very first blast furnaces and steel mills had been constructed there even before World War I. So that if you go to Strakowice today, there is a museum of early Polish industrialization at what is called the Hochholen, or the blast furnace, and you can actually walk around the grounds of where where the blast furnace is and see that as a Polish museum to early industrialization. The factory that was for munitions is now a tractor factory, so it's there too. But the process basically was a 2-part. They would bring in iron ore or scrap metal. They would smelt it at the blast furnace and then roll it into sheets. Then they take that to the munitions factory where you have machines that stamp it out into shells of different calibers and to grenade casings. So it is small caliber ammunition and grenades, what are the chief products here. The camp that made gunpowder is up the road to Skaržisko Kamienice, which is just about 25 or 30 miles away. And that's where they also had an additional factory that made the explosives. So explosives were not made here, so there was never an accident in which anything blew up. And that the factories basically remained